Chapter 9 of Stonecaller. Yeah, basically, I'm reading my dad's manuscripts. I'm on third book now. And this one is called Stonecaller. It's a fantasy adventure. I'm reading chapter 9. Stonecaller is a follow-up novel to Talisman of the Winds. If you didn't hear me reading that, you'll want to go back to my past broadcasts and listen to that. And then you can listen to everything and get all caught up. In the meantime, here is chapter 9. Redo, only with volume now. Chapter 9. Lord Quedram? He looked up. It was a light horseman, little more than a boy, with a bow in hand, and a quiver at his saddle, still containing half a dozen bright feathered arrows. From the look of his face, the battle had not been what he had imagined. Nothing at all. Yet he was up and following orders, or perhaps it was because he had orders to carry out, that he could and would go on. Lord Quedram? The lady sent me to look for you. Some feared you may not have survived. Are you hurt? No, I'm not hurt. I suppose I survived if this might be called surviving. If you wish, Lord, you could ride with me. Ride with you? Well, that's a thought. But I'm still holding on to my horse. I suppose if I can just get myself up and onto him, I could manage. Just give me a moment. No, don't bother getting down. I should be able to do this myself. His horse had stood calmly hitched to the reins in his hand, sidled a bit as Quedram tried to mount. He sprawled across the animal's back, hauling himself bit by bit into more or less proper seat in the saddle. The next difficulty was staying in the saddle as they moved. They went on a light canter, and Quedram was holding on with his knees as tightly as possible, and shortly came to the fire where the lady and the other commanders were gathered. Gwathnurin frowned slightly at Quedram, then turned to the lady. She had removed her armor, but it was clear that she had taken part in the day's battle. Her expression was only a little less dazed than that of the young light horseman who had fetched Quedram. Lady, I believe we are all present and accounted for? Thank you, Gwathnurin. Lords, we've come through this day, and Batless is driven from the field. There is no question this time of a drawn battle. However, our losses have been severe. Definite numbers are not yet available, but we appear to have lost between a quarter and a third of our troops. We cannot afford another battle soon, and preferably we will not fight again until next year. But then again, Batless will not be fighting soon either. He appears to be retreating toward Dara. He will not wish to shut himself up in Higford, deep in hostile territory. I understand it's very soon after a terrible battle to make plans for future moves, but I am led to understand that Batless has left a large garrison in the city of Higford. But what effect the outcome of today's battle will have on them is not yet determined. However, whether the garrison fights or surrenders, I believe we can muster sufficient force to take the town. She paused. Lords, gentlemen, soldiers, all, I congratulate you. Worn, weary, battered and used up, they could still manage a cheer for their lady. You buggered it up, Quedram! Not badly enough to lose us a battle, but you buggered it up! All you had to do was concentrate on your work on the potterymen, but you had to go for the flash, throw a few rocks down at the enemy who were out of your territory, giving the potterymen that much more time to get at the men you were supposed to be supporting. Gwathnurin was blazing angry, and Quedram, who had not yet had a chance to sleep, was barely capable of staring at him blankly. Destroyer's teeth! Don't you have anything to say? You don't even realize how badly you've buggered it up? Say something! More Corey in you! Seemed like a good idea at the time, Quedram muttered. The trouble was, he'd known he'd buggered it up. Known from the instant he turned from admiring the confusion he'd caused among Batless's light infantry to see how close the potterymen were. All the time that he was frantically searching, trying to make up for his error, he'd known he might be the cause of their defeat. Seemed like a good idea, you Morcor-eaten little gamester. You're gaming with people's lives, with the Kermes's life. You're not supposed to have good ideas. You're supposed to carry out your part. The fist-sized stone landed with a thump at Quathnaren's feet, and he stopped to take a look at it. I was wrong, Quedrim admitted. I was wrong, and we all nearly paid for it, but I'm tired, and I don't need you to dress me down as though I was one of your troopers who'd showed up on parade with a little rust spot on his sword. In case you want to know, I'll have to live with what went on out there, and I know it. I'm tired, so save your words. I'm going to find a bed. It didn't make him feel much better to know that the losses taken against the potterymen, while a great part of the total, were nowhere near the most. He'd made a mistake, been just a little too confident about what he could do. He considered asking for an interview with the lady, offering to give up his titles as punishment for his error. The lady was already too busy with planning for the next move, to seeing to the state of the army, and all the things that went with being the Carmista. She had no time to grant him absolution, even if absolution would have helped him any. He managed a more or less calm interview with the Lord Quathnaren. Quathnaren managed to compose himself, to realize that Quedrim had an ability no one possessed, and therefore could not be summarily dealt with. Better to work matters out so that difficulties didn't happen again. There is a difficulty with our battles. So much dust gets stirred up in that time, you can't see just where you ought to be. I'm not using this as an excuse. It wasn't until the battle had been going on for a while that the dust became a problem. We'll want to think about that for the future. Quathnaren nodded. It should have occurred to me before. We'll have to take that into consideration. That was that. Well, Quedrim thought, perhaps we just weren't fated to become drinking companions. The army camped there for several days, just off the battlefield. Their light horse patrolled for miles around them. One party was shadowing Batlas's army. The Carmost was surely heading for home, but Quathnaren was not about to take the chance of him deciding to do something else. Another party of light horse went off to the city of Higfrid to inform the garrison of the battle's results, and to call them to surrender. We don't expect much to come of that, Quathnaren told the assembly. It's just a matter of doing the standard things. Who knows? The garrison might just surrender to a party of horse archers. There was a chuckle from the group. Quedrim thought the party might have had more luck if he had accompanied it. The rumors would have to come to Higfrid regarding the fall of Lackvosta, likely even of the flying stones in the recent battle. If he were to throw a couple of stones at the walls, the garrison might just surrender to a party of horse archers. However, he had still been in a state of deep depression when that party had been sent out, and Quathnaren, he suspected, was still too angry to trust Quedrim on such a mission. Shapakalish appeared in the camp. He came trudging over a hill, leading his mule, as though he traveled several leagues that day. Quedrim, who happened to be nearby, suspected he had come by his hidden ways to somewhere, perhaps just over the hill, perhaps over the hill just beyond that, and trudged from there. There was nothing especially unusual about his coming to the army. Several peddlers and merchants had made their way out there since the battle. Shapakalish's only distinction was his size. He sold nothing out of the ordinary. A selection of simple talismans, a bit of wine, wet stones, this and that. From all Quedrim could tell, he did not appear to deal in any great magics at all, only little things. Finally, of course, he ended up outside the tent Quedrim shared with the two lords. Having become used to each other's company, they had continued to share lodgings. At this particular time, the two lords were elsewhere, so Quedrim greeted his visitor alone. "Ha, most noble slinger. Hero of stormings and battles, hurler of great rocks. Your fire starter still performs well, I trust?" Quedrim was still touchy about the battle, and his part in it, took the greeting as a jibe, and then the sudden change of topic took him by surprise. "Fire starter? What fire starter?" "Ha, he's forgotten so soon. In the midst of winter rains on the rough trail out of the hills towards Guachuros, this humble soul sold you a talisman guaranteed to start a fire, even the wettest wood." Quedrim had indeed forgotten. He did not feel disposed to be polite and friendly, though. Oh, yes, and overpriced, too, as I recall. The little man put on a hurt expression. Only the best of quality, O Lord, and for the best quality one must expect to pay. And so I did. Now what do you want? Ah, he has become so brusque and rude, the young slinger on the road, living his wits alone. Perhaps it is that the reward has not been completely paid? Quedrum held back a scathing retort about the fact that the prospect of a marriage at the Carmista with himself was very unlikely. Though there didn't seem to be anyone in earshot, he knew you didn't say things in supposed privacy in that camp that you didn't want to hear coming back dressed up in a variety of styles. No, I think I've messed things up quite well on my own. Or do I blame you for all of this? Ah, he seeks someone to blame. Tell me, if as one presumes, the world goes on tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day after that, what will you do, and how? I suppose I'll have to go on as I have been, Quedrum muttered grouchily. As you have been? Ah, but which of you? The lame but canny gambler, with an eye always to money, or the one who has found someone besides himself to care for? Quedrum almost reached out and shook the little man for saying such things in camp. What kinds of rumors would be going around after this? The little man only looked at him. Ah, he worries. Do not fear, O nervous young slinger. Do you think one with my resources would allow my words to be overheard and reported? If anyone passed by and is asked what we talked about, all he will have is vague memories that it was the usual thing. Now, as to my question. As Shapakalish spoke, Quedrum was thinking of how he'd failed the lady. Then a thought occurred to him. This burden he felt, what she must feel, with the whole of the army, all its losses, all on her back. So if he moped around, feeling sorry for himself, what good would he be to her or to anyone? Yes, he'd messed things up, and badly. What now? Go through the rest of his life with this one battle as a weight on his shoulders? Or take a lesson from it and go on? He looked at Shapakalish with suspicion. Have you done something to me? I? Do something to you? Never! O great and powerful Lord! All I have done is to speak words. That you listened and heeded was all you're doing. It was you who brought me to Higfrid. You embroiled me in all this. It was you who brought me to Higfrid. You embroiled me in all this. Ah, well, yes, admitted Shapakalish. I took the liberty of bringing you to Higfrid. However, all your embroilments, as you call them, were done by yourself, taking decisions of your own, with no one but yourself directing those actions. So, well, suppose we go back to your question. I will go on. The lady has come to expect certain things of me. I will not disappoint her. As for the ridiculous notions of marriage, leave that aside. I'm a foreigner who's been granted noble status here for some things I've done, but that's about all. Ah, and now the great Lord is modest as well. The little man held up a hand to forestall anything Quedrum might say. No more. I have in my pack a jug of fine wine, one which I guarantee will not have been seriously harmed by traveling. I had planned to sell it to some royal court for 10 coins. I am willing, however, to part with it for a mere 10 silvers. 10 silvers? Is it, too, guaranteed to start a fire with the wettest wood? 5 silver, if it's drinkable at all, and not the sort of vinegar that goes to the soldiers. You wrong me, most noble. Wronged me most terribly. This is a wine the like of which you've never tasted. I am cheating myself to offer it as low as 8 silver. The final price was 6 silver and 4 coppers. On the condition, Quedrum had satisfied himself that the wine was good. Shapakalish went rummaging in his mule packs, muttering as he did so, about merchandise that went into the hiding when it was most needed, even when it was sold for a terribly low price. At last he brought out a wax-sealed jug and handed it to Quedrum. Quedrum tasted it and agreed that it was indeed a good wine, better than anything available in camp, save perhaps at the carmista's own table. He paid over the coins and took the jug inside. He had a few sips of it and saved the rest to share with Malsanto and Genelabus that evening. "Where did you come by this?" inquired Genelabus. "Have you been raiding the carmista's stores?" "Bought it from a little peddler." "Good, isn't it?" "Good? That's like saying the carmista's palace is a big house. Wouldn't you say so, Jenny?" "At least. But you consider this, Malsa. He's sharing it with us. This means we'd best stay friends with him. He can share all sorts of things with us as he rises in the carmista's favor." "Ha! I'm about as high in her favor as I am likely to get. Don't hold your breath waiting for me to share something with you, you greedy sot." At last they marched on the city of Higfrid. The army were in good spirits for all the losses they had taken. They were now the twice victorious army of Higfrid, despite Betless and his Hartery soldiers. From the sound and the look of them, you'd think they need only make an appearance, give a shove of their hand to make the city gates swing open, Gwythneren said. "Perhaps they do. Or perhaps they expect the all-powerful Quedrum to juggle a few stones for the garrison and have them open the gates," Quedrum muttered darkly. Gwythneren glanced at him. The relations between the two continued to be strained. The lady spoke up as though she didn't realize she was stepping in to prevent an argument between her commander and his very important weapon. "Better to have the men in good spirits than in bad, and the garrison may well be in the mood for surrender when Quedrum gives them the show. They'll have heard very inflated tales of him. To know he is real might just be the incentive they need to surrender." Quedrum limited himself to thinking that the reality behind the stories was much different, and likely much less impressive than the stories. Their light horse brought back the word that the Dorey garrison in Higfrid had refused to surrender. Gwythneren merely shrugged. "Well, that was never more than a vague hope. I wonder what they'll make of Quedrum. Will you be ready to give a demonstration for them, Quedrum?" "Oh yes, I can do that for sure. We'll have to see how impressive I can be." 2 days later, they were before the walls of the city itself. "You have some idea what you might try to do, Quedrum?" "Oh, I think I can manage something." He was almost a little disappointed when Gwythneren merely looked at him sternly, nodded, and turned away. So he rode down with the herald for company to a place within clear sight of the walls, but out of bowshot. The herald went a little further forward to be sure of being heard from the walls. "Soldiers of Dara!" the herald called. "You know that your Carmost has been defeated and has withdrawn to his own city. The Lady Anavristi, Carmista of Higfrid, calls on you to surrender. Before you respond, however, please watch the following demonstration." Quedrum had brought no stones with him, for the same reasons he had invited the Gafrati soldiers to examine the stones he'd used when he demonstrated his abilities for them. He couldn't exactly invite the garrison to inspect the stones he used, so he did the next best. As they approached, and as the herald spoke, he made note of several usable stones. Now, one after another, he wrenched them from the earth and held them floating over his head. That done, he set them to moving, forming and reforming patterns, marching and countermarching, whirling and dancing around him. Finally, he sent them flying over to the city walls, and landed them softly there, and left them sitting. They would be reminders for the people who manned that part of the wall, reminder that the sort of thing they faced. "Ask them now," he looked at the herald. "Ask them now." "Yes, Lord." The herald turned back to the walls, and called out, "Men of Dora, will ye surrender? The lady promises you will be allowed to depart unhindered." There was quiet for a long while. Then an archer stood up and launched an arrow, well off to their right. It was only a signal of refusal, though a strong one. Attacking a herald or a member of a party coming to parley would result in a slaughter of the defenders if the city were taken. "Ha!" Quedrum took his sling from his belt, dropped one of his stones in it, and slung the stone toward the wall, close to the now hidden archer. It was an impossible distance for a sling. The watchers from the walls would know that. When the stone hit the wall, flinging up a spray of stone chips, sparks, and mortar, he felt the lesson would not be lost. Now, he said to the herald, let's get back. So now we attack, or do we try to starve them out? Solbadancer was grim. They seemed not at all impressed by rock juggling. Wathiran frowned, but ignored the jibe at Quedrum, and spoke to the actual statement. A siege is possible, but not desirable. We want the city reasonably whole, with as little harm to the people as possible. And further, though I hope it will not go further than this assembly, there is a small possibility Batlas might send out an army if he hears we're sitting siege here. It's not the sort of risk he takes, but to depend on your enemy to continually follow a certain pattern is to invite surprise and defeat. He paused. Now, we know that the garrison is a little more than 1,000, and we are fairly certain there are none of those potterymen in there. They are not suited for garrison work. And Batlas likely took all of them out when he came to meet us. We already have parties making onagri and ballistae as towers and ladders. We will assault the walls as soon as is practicable. What do we need for catapults? Asked Solbadancer, keen to have his tots noticed. We have Quedrum on our side. Sorry, oh my goodness. Let me reread that. What do we need for catapults? Asked Solbadancer, keen to have his taunts noticed. We have Quedrum on our side. Oh, don't fear, Lord Solbadancer. Quedrum will be doing his part. You see to it you do yours. Quedrum stood at a sufficient distance from the wall that no arrow could reach him. He unwound his sling, put one of the special stones into it, whirled it 3 times around his head, and let it fly. There had been a head barely showing at that point, but the man ducked down again. It might just be possible. As the stone went over the top of the wall, Quedrum reached out to it, curved his path, and brought it around back to the wall to hit the wall where he guessed the man might be. It was all done against an unseen target, but he thought it likely he'd hit the man. After all, the fellow would most likely just duck down, not move to the side as well. If, after a while, everyone got up there and got used to not only having to duck but had to move as well, it could only be good for the army of Higfrid. He did the same twice more, and though he could never be sure of a hit, he knew he had given them something to think about. Then there was movement up there, and he saw them setting up a ballista. It was much like a bow, but the arms were powered with twisted ropes, not springy wood. Depending on how it was built, it could shoot either large arrows or stones up to the size of 2 fists. They were having some difficulty setting it up without any of them revealing themselves, and he figured he'd gotten 2 men, though had ducked below the wall. This ballista was had sort of a shield built on the front, making it a bit unwieldy, but a bit safer for its crew. It occurred to him that he could hit the crew now and then, but they would just replace the men and continue to work the thing. At about that moment, the ballista launched an arrow. He moved over a little and saw the thing bury itself in the dirt, just off from where he would have been standing. There's another thing with the ballista. It was most effective against masses of men, when aiming at one particular person wouldn't matter. He looked down at his sling. You got just this one trick, Quedrum? He looked around, spotted a head-sized stone, and sent it at the wall, speeding it up as it went. The crew could dodge, but the ballista couldn't, nor could the crew move it quickly enough. Splinters flew, twisted ropes spun free, broken pieces of wood went in all directions. There, take that! I have a notion, but I'm not sure I've got it all worked out. Yes? Wathiran's tone of voice indicated willingness to listen, at least. Suppose I get some stones up there, go after anyone who shows themselves along a whole section of wall. At the same time, we get the rest of the army going up against that wall with ladders. I might just be able to give our men, or our people, a chance to go up and over. I suggest something like that for La Caposta. You rejected it. I wasn't sure then what my abilities might allow. Still not really, but I'd be willing to do some trials, see what works. A large part of the Grafrati army advanced in columns toward the walls of Higford. The advance parties carried scaling ladders. Belstay appeared on the walls, and Quedrim went to work with some fist-sized rocks, sending them flying toward the walls, each aimed at one of the engines. The Belstay barely got into action when the flying stones reduced them to wrecks of wood and rope. There were men still up there, though, and some with armed with bows and slings. They could still topple scaling ladders. Quedrim assembled 5 large stones, each about the size of a man's head, and sent them floating toward the wall. The relatively slow approach was deliberate, to allow the men up there some time to see the stones approach. He held them up there, equally spaced, about 5 feet above the wall. Few up there stood stupidly staring at the things, and Quedrim brought the stones down hard on the side of the wall, then moved them to the right and to the left about a foot from below the wall, and then back again, and up to their previous positions. Got a few. Taught the rest to keep their heads down, Quedrim thought. It would have been nice to have taught the lesson once and had it hold long enough for the first Grafrati to come over the wall, but he knew that was unlikely. When the ladders hit the walls, the defenders would be up to deal with them. So it proved. When the ladders hit the walls, men stood to deal with them. Again, Quedrim brought the stones down hard, moved them rapidly 4 feet over, then 6 feet back, keeping his motion up inside the wall. When the Grafrati reached the top of the ladders, he lifted the stones and held them. With any luck, the dory would be so confused and intimidated they wouldn't rise fast enough to face the men who were coming over. Most likely it seemed to be the case, Quedrim muttered. Old woman's apron! As he saw a ladder full of men pushed out and away from the wall. He'd been holding his stones in place just in case he saw an opportunity, and he used his chance. He brought all the stones over to the section of the wall and brought them in fast and hard toward the wall, bringing them out and back again. He continued to do this, preventing the dory from standing to attack men on the other ladders. Though they managed to topple the one ladder, that was the only success, partial though it was, on the defender's side. As more Grafrati took to the ladders and swarmed up the walls, the outcome became more and more certain. At last there was a shout. "They've opened the Doghead's gate!" More Grafrati went forward shouting, heading toward the gate and in. After that, it was only a matter of waiting. Smoke began to rise in various parts of the city. Someone muttered, "They've set fire to it rather than letting us have it." Gwathnarin snorted. "I'll be willing to bet a few of those fires have been started by our own loyal soldiers. Seems like when men get their blood up, setting fires is the only thing they like to do, even if it means their own countrymen will be burned out of it because of it." About mid-afternoon, a man came hurrying out of the gate, and as he approached, he could be distinguished as a light infantryman, sweaty and smeared with dirt and blood. He flung himself down at the Carmista's feet. "Lady, Higford is yours once more." "Thank you, soldier." She looked around. "Someone, find this man a drink of wine." Gwathnarin was already giving orders to the commander of the infantry reserve. "Get some parties fighting those fires. We don't want to present the Carmista with a charred ruin." "Yes, Lord." Quedrim stood there, breathing deeply. He hadn't worn himself out this time. Not nearly. But he'd still be glad to find a bed. He had a sudden feeling he'd like Gwathnarin to say, "Well done, Quedrim," but he knew there wasn't much chance of that. Probably the best he could expect was that the commander would not make any specific mention of the ladder that had been knocked over despite Quedrim's efforts. Even losing one ladder full of men was somewhere around 10 times less than usual, perhaps better. It wasn't for several hours that he decided he might as well go into the city. All the fighting's done. I'm not likely to catch a sword by accident, he thought. He had no commander to forbid him, and save for perhaps Gwathnarin, and since battle was done, the only reason Lord Gwathnarin would interfere with Quedrim's movements would be sheer perversity. Whatever Lord Gwathnarin's other faults, that was not one of them. A good study of the a good deal of the city was in no bad shape, since the fighting had been restricted to certain districts where the garrison had gathered or rallied in their attempts to hold the city, or to try making his taking too expensive for the Grafrati. Quidrim found his feet taking him on the route to the Copper Bowl, the wine shop where he had first run games when he had just come to the city. Though much of the city had shut and locked itself up pending the final results of the Grafrati attack, the Copper Bowl had already opened. This was no great surprise to Quidrim. It had struck him as the sort of place that might have stayed open during the battle itself, where the proprietor and certain soldiers roused by battle would likely take what they wanted with no thought of such petty matters as payment. The owner would, however, cut corners he could and run a few risks just to make a bit more money. Quidrim felt this line of reasoning uncomfortably close to his own about a year or so ago. It was not so uncomfortable as to prevent him from having a cup of wine, though, and he was almost glad he was the only person in the place. The wine was very poor stuff, thin and sour with an aftertaste of some sort he couldn't identify. But it was wine, and it was what was available. Whatever else its properties, on top of his labors of the morning, it relaxed him almost to the point of falling asleep right there. He wondered if he should show up at the palace expecting to be fed and housed there. The Carmista would just be settling in, though, finding out what had been lost or ruined in her absence. Finding old or new servants, too, most likely. No, going to the palace was a foolish thought, to say the least. Best he should go back to his tent outside the city. If the lady desired his presence, she'd send for him. His two tent mates were already in the tent, sleeping when he arrived. Being as careful as possible not to disturb them, he found his own place and fell asleep himself. The next day saw a lot of rushing around. The army, save for some parties kept in the city to maintain order, was returned to its encampment outside the city. There was much coming and going, with the lady arranging or rearranging affairs in the city. Men who had been a part of the rule of the town, the entire state for all that, under Battlus's rule, had been cast out of their places. If the people who had served under the lady could not be found, other worthy persons must be discovered. There was much coming and going, with the lady arranging or rearranging affairs in the city. Men who had been a part of the rule of the town, the entire state for all that, under Battlus's rule, had been cast out of their places. If the people who had served under the lady could not be found, other worthy persons must be discovered. Lord Gwythneren will find it a little more difficult to deal with the place hunters than the besieging army, Malsanto said. With a besieging army he can use his sword. With this lot, though they may not be picked for any particular task, they may be necessary for efficiently running the city, and a favor of some kind may be needed sometime in the future, from even the least likely of them. So their presence must be suffered, at least until the lady has all the scribes and magistrates she requires, and the rest politely dismissed. Quidrim found himself a little cheered by the thought of Gwythneren faced with that sort of difficulty. He felt himself at loose ends. There wasn't much call now for a lifter and hurler of stones, though he was certain his service would not be forgotten. The lady was not that sort. Even Gwythneren, for all his faults, would not ignore someone whose services he would need in the future, if only as so far as next year, when Battlus tried them again. However, Quidrim had gone through much of the money the lady had paid him as a reward last year, and at some time or another, possibly before she was ready to entertain guests again, he would need more. His only method of earning money was running some sort of game, and without various tricks to make the betting all one-sided, a gambler's living was not likely to be prosperous in the long run. Not to mention gambling, even without cheating, was not work close friends of the Carmista engaged in. Second best would be putting on shows for money, making stones dance and the like, but that didn't seem right either. As he was thinking these sorts of morose thoughts, Malsanto stood. "Come, Lord Quidrim, it's too fine a day to sit in a cool old tent growing mushrooms around the ears. Come on, let's go walk in the city." "The city's still a wreck, Malsa, not much to be seen." "Oh, and you know all this without looking? Come along, most grouchy Lord of Quidrim of the big stones, or we'll cut the tent ropes and drop it on top of you." At which Quidrim, despite his dark mood, managed to force a grin. All right then, let's go. Since you seem to be intent on pestering me, we go find a wine shop and I can beggar the both of you by betting I can make stones dance with my fingers. He felt a twinge, recalling times when he would have done just that. Close friends of the Carmista can't hoodwink their friends. Well, fact is, they can actually have friends. But you forget, we know all your secrets. We'd be betting on you, not against you. Oh, and if we get you drunk enough, I think we can manage to talk you into betting against me. The city was very near back to itself again. The dead had been carted outside the city and buried. The markets were open, and there were even some activity there. Stonecaller had set up shop there, selling mostly herbal remedies of one sort or another. Look, it's a little peddler who's selling those things in camp. Where on earth do you suppose he's from? Wondered Gentle Abbess. Hard to say. I've never seen his like. What about you, Quadrim? I've seen him. I've bought a thing or two from him, but I've no idea where he came from. And I don't want to know, he thought to himself. He just as soon have gone by, even if it meant heading right to the copper bowl and its poor wine. But Malsa insisted otherwise. You, little fellow, where do you hail from? Myself, O great lord? I come from a far country, one which I doubt your grace has heard of. What's it called? I'll tell you if I've heard of it. Stonecaller bowed. I'm led to believe the name of the place is Ohaza. You're led to believe? Don't you know? Stonecaller bowed again. Lord, my people traveled a good deal. Got you there, Malsa, Jenny said with a grin. Come on, let's go. If it is any interest to you, lords, I have a skin of wine of very good quality, which I am willing to sell exceedingly cheaply. Ha! Come on, lads. I bought cheap things from him, and they weren't cheap. Quadrim steered his friends away from the little man. He heard behind him protests of how he was maligning the name of the poor merchant. They went off and found a wine shop, not the Copper Bowl, and had several cups of mediocre wine. Despite some urging, Quadrim refused to show any tricks with the stones. They returned to their tent, wearing the cheery mood found in the bottom of a wine cup. Of course, the lady had not forgotten Quadrim, or perhaps she had finally remembered him, and a servant came to the tent. Quadrim did not immediately recognize this rather slender man as Valish, who had served him so long ago, but the first words reminded him. Quadrim of Arundel, Lady Anavristi invites you to be her guest at the palace. It's Valish, isn't it? The servant looked a little startled. Lords did not usually go out of their way to remember servants' names. Yes, Lord. Yes, you've changed a bit. It's been a difficult year for some of us who've served the lady most closely. I, in my good fortune, had an uncle who had a place in the market, so I was able to eat. Yes, fortunate for you. Clearly you didn't eat as much as you were used to. And if you will allow me, Lord, I will gather your effects and carry them for you. Thank you. I don't have much. I'll carry the sling myself. He grinned at the remembrance of the to-do over the sling and the stones last time, but Valish either did not remember or chose not to appear to. Even when he got to the palace, he did not see the Carmista, save from a distance, then mostly at meal times. Whatever went into running the Carmosat. Apparently there was even more when recovering from someone else's rule. There were scribes there. Scribes taking people's... Scribes here, scribes there, people taking notes, people writing letters in the Carmista's name, the Carmista or the Lord Gwythnarn or other high-level functionaries of people dictating letters to people. 3 days after having been reinstalled to the palace, a servant came to speak to him. Lord, there's a businessman named Echetral wishing to speak to you regarding your land. It took Quadrim a moment to recall just what the land the man might be referring to. Then he recalled the land the Carmista had awarded to him last year. Have him sent in, he said, curious as to what this was all about. The man who came in was short, even for a Gaffraud, sturdily built, dressed like a merchant, though seeming well muscled for a merchant. Lord, I understand that you own a certain parcel of land outside the city. Yes, said Quidrim, a little wary. It is mine, but it cannot be sold, just in case this fellow was some sharper intent on doing Quidrim's out of his land. Ah, no, I did not wish to purchase it. I wish to inquire if you'll favor me by saying, is this land being worked at present? No, not as yet. The thought of giving the truthful answer, I have no notion as to how one goes about farming, was too embarrassing. In the Arndals, one would usually buy a few sheep to run on any land they owned. Ah, fine, fine. Etchetrel went so far as to rub his hands. Suppose I were to offer you 40 silver per year for the right to cultivate it. That sounds like an interesting offer, but I wouldn't want to make a hasty decision. Could you come back in 2 days' time? This is not a proposal to be put off for long, Lord. Quidrim, recognizing an effort to push him into making a hasty decision, said, If I must make a decision now, at this moment, the decision would be that I will not deal with you or any agent of yours. Will you be willing to wait 2 days? That evening, Quidrim went searching for his two friends and tracked them down into a wine shop. They were both a little merry, but when he explained the offer he'd been given, they seemed to sober up greatly. 40 silver? He knows you're a foreigner, or he wouldn't have even tried an offer like that. Push him up to 100, and go as low as 60. Lower than that, he's taking advantage of you. Mal Santo was adamant. Genelabus agreed. He's right, Quidrim. The fellow's trying to take advantage. The land is really atrocious. Even 70 per year isn't too much. The day after next, Etchetrel appeared. He had clearly decided that Lord Quidrim, though he might be a foreigner, had likely gotten good advice. He did try for 40 silver. When Quidrim countered with 100, it took very little effort to get the deal close to at 65 silver per year. Malsanto and Genelabus served as witnesses for Quidrim and 2 other people. Farmers from the look of them witnessed Etchetrel. They wrote up the contract, then sealed and deposited it for safekeeping in the god's house near to the main gate. Okay, so that is all for tonight. I did have some questions in the chat, so I'll quickly answer those. Basically, for those of you just tuning in, this is me reading a story that my father wrote. He's no longer here, but this story specifically is called Stonecaller. Where we are at right now is basically a gambling man who has this magical ability to be able to affect stone. Basically, he can lift stone, move it around, sort of like a telekinesis sort of thing. He has this ability, and that's why it's called Stonecaller. And it's basically about him falling into work with the Carmista, who must take back her land. That's just a quick synopsis. Beyond that, I'm not really sure everything else that happens in here, because this is my first time reading it as well, so what's new to you is also new to me. So with each chapter, we're both learning. It could be anything, so I'm hoping that the rest of the story, because they so far seem to be good. This is also a sequel to a previous story called Talisman of the Winds, which also deals with the same character, Sheppa Kalish. So if you're interested, I also read that one earlier. That was the first one that I read on Twitch. So you can go back into my past broadcasts and you can listen to me read it there. For those of you, thank you for joining me tonight, and thank you for bearing with me with the atrocious and no audio, and then coming back when I had to change over to a different method of streaming. Really appreciate it. Thank you all, and I will see you tomorrow. So take care, guys. Thank you so much.